crisis where we explore what the future may hold, and most importantly, how we can actually use this crisis that we're all living through in 2020 to accelerate the progress we're trying to make in life, in work, and with our finances as well. So I'm excited today to have Cara Snow as our guest. Cara is the Chief Community Engagement Officer for the Technology Association of Oregon, where she focuses on member engagement, cybersecurity programming, and workforce development, with a focus there on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she likes to say she was working in tech before it was cool, which I think is a cool thing to say. So I'm interested to talk to Cara today to learn more about the state of the technology industry in Oregon, how individuals and firms that are part of the TAO are coping and pivoting in the midst of this pandemic, and how the association is adjusting as well, and what's working in workforce engagement. I know she spends a lot of time there. So welcome, Cara.
We're gonna have that moment where my cat probably comes on screen, but it's just the beauty of working from home.
Perfect. Well, I look forward to that. You can introduce your cat when she or he makes an appearance.
Perfect. Sounds great.
So, Cara, I thought an interesting place to start would be, I know that you're a runner.
Yes.
I know that you've done a TEDx talk.
Yes.
And yet the topic of that TEDx talk was actually on picking up spare change, a lot of that while you're running. So I think that paints a good picture of who you are and your passion for building community. So maybe if we could just start there, tell us about your TEDx talk and how that came to be.
Yeah, so thank you for asking about that. It was quite an experience, and I always tell people to not take my experience, but to do it the right way. So my mom passed away about 7 years ago. She grew up very lower middle class, and so there was not a lot of money, and she was the fifth of six, so hand-me-downs were real. And if you found money, that was yours. And so she was just she had hawk eyes to find spare change. And after she passed away, my brother kind of struggled with how to connect. And so it was this habit of picking up the money. And so he did it for a while and was like, I actually find a lot of money. We should have a party or do something with it. And then, the world is hard. And so he was like, look, it's been you and me and 6 of our friends, and we've got $600. Let's donate it instead and do something for the community. And so that first year that we gave money was 2016. We had a friend that worked for Family Foundation, and she was like, oh, I think I can get a match. And so she went in with our we rolled all the change and then got the bank to give us the cash. So she goes in and it's $600.18. And the guy that runs the foundation was like, I mean, this is what you want matched? I can pull this out of my wallet. This is the funniest thing I've ever seen. But we were like, no, we worked really hard to pick all this up. And what was cool is we invested it back into a homeless program in our community. And we got to go and actually do some outreach on the streets. And so it just became this way that if we're finding the money in our community, how do we invest it back, and what can we do at scale as a group? That's the cat, her name is Trixie. And so we did it for a while, and I mean the last several years. And if you came to on Sunday, which was great. And then were you able to hear me through all of that?
I lost you shortly after the cat.
Shortly after, who's still here. I don't know why, I have full. Well, at any rate, we kept doing this, and I found 54 cents on Sunday out on my run, a quarter, a nickel, a dime, 2 dimes, and 4 pennies. And we refer to that as going for the cycle, in baseball.
Got it.
But it was really cool because it made us pay a ton more attention to what was going on in our neighborhood, because when you're looking around versus at your phone. And so I gave it as a college commencement speech at the University of Georgia, really talking about all of the small things that you do over the course of your day that make a career at the end. And when you're graduating, like, how do you know how to define that? And you don't. It's just all those small things you do. And then through that, I was asked by TEDx Atlanta to be a alternate. And so I had 3 weeks to prepare my TEDx.
Wow.
It's not perfect, but it was fun. And I do still pick up the money, and it is still like a common language between me and my brother and my whole kind of group of friends. But it is like, it's a community of us that do it. And then everybody gives the money back into their community, which is kind of cool. And then it's like this family tradition. So it's, it's just what we do.
Yeah. Well, it's a very cool story. Thank you for sharing it. And I think there's a lot of nuggets there. I mean, one is just consistency. You continue to do it. One's paying attention to the small things, like you're talking about, and giving back into the community that you all live in. So it's cool. It's a great story.
I was going to add one other thing is like, you really don't realize like how big the impact can be. And I think that's like what's so important from a community building standpoint. Like the money we gave that first year, which wound up being like $1,200, like that is enough money for the program that we were supporting to, I think, get like 7 veterans into financial literacy training so that they could learn how to do budgeting themselves. And like,
wow.
It's not a lot of money to do something that's pretty impactful in somebody's life. And I think sometimes we're so worried about these like big moments of like change that you forget that like small moments can just happen literally with spare change. So like, I mean, it's cool.
Yeah, no, something seemingly small can make a pretty big impact. So that's very cool.
Yeah, it's fun.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was this notion of community. Your role is Chief Community Engagement Officer, and I would imagine that's become a lot more challenging in 2020. You guys historically have done a ton of live events, multiple ones per week, I think. I mean, I don't know how many you did in 2019, for example, but that's a big part of it. How are you adjusting? How are firms, as part of the Tech Association of Oregon, adjusting to this new sort of virtual environment? And I guess the question is like, in terms of community engagement, like what's working and what's not working?
Yeah, well, I think that's evolved, right? Since this whole thing started. We did 100+ events in 2019. We are on track to do way more than that from an online perspective in 2020. I think one thing that worked really well for us is we did transition super quickly. And so from a community standpoint, we took away the price barrier for all of our members. So anyone could attend anything that was online. And we started bringing in Secretary or Treasurer of the State, Tobias Reed, and we have Nick Blosser that's joining us in a few weeks. And we brought in folks from Portland Public Schools, and we brought in Senator Lou Frederick to talk about police reform. And so what we brought to the tech community as a whole was a lot of programming that was generally reserved for our executives. And so we really opened that up and did it in a way where there was zero cost associated with it. We have an online member engagement platform, and we had not fully rolled that out. And now we have. And, we thought if you very much like Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. That's not what online engagement is about. And so we've spent the last 6 months, like when a new member joins, like we encourage them to do a welcome post so that people can get to know them and talk to them. And so we're learning how to do that as we go. But through that platform, we started doing something that, it seems so intuitive, but we didn't do a ton of. Like we started asking like members, what time of day works best for you? We were really heavy on lunch programming in person because people can get out of the office, get lunch, and go back.
Right.
When you're working from home and your children are doing their distance learning, or you've been online for 6 hours, or you want to walk your dog, like that lunchtime doesn't work anymore. Like people are preserving that. And so we've been super responsive from a content and a timing perspective to our members. Initially, we did a lot of the things that were fun that everyone else did, like have happy hour online with us, like join us for an evening of watching a movie. And then we've realized as the summer's gone on that that's exhausting. And this takes a lot of energy out of you, and people don't want to do it after 5 anymore. And so we've shifted things like that to 4, and we've sent like fun cocktail kits, and we've done a wine tasting with a crew out of Napa. And so we're working on looking into next year, like, do we have a blend of on-demand videos that are rolled out and some live? But with our online engagement platform, we have ways that we can collect a lot more data than we have in the past and respond to it. So a lot of it is probably a word that you will continue to hear as you do this series, and as you've done it, is we just keep pivoting.
Yeah, right. And keep testing and seeing what's working, and do more of that, obviously. One of the things that I'd be curious to get your perspective on is, I guess, the engagement part of the events that you're doing. So I had a conversation with Ali Magyar, who's the founder and CEO of Hub, who I know you know, and they've done events in the past and built software for events. Obviously, most of those have switched to online. And one of the comments that she's made is, a virtual event is not just a webcast or a webinar. There's more to it. And one of the big pieces of value that people get historically or have gotten from going to an event or going to a conference is the ability to make meaningful connections with the other people that are part of that event. So how are you thinking about getting people to engage and enabling them to make connections? And maybe both what you're doing at the Tech Association, but like, what could a manager or somebody leading a company learn from what you guys have learned this year in terms of getting their workforce engaged with everybody else and everything that they're doing as a company in this environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things that we're doing and that we're looking at doing. So our tech awards are in September. Our People's Choice is open for voting right now. That event's going to be completely online. It's going to be a mix of like pre-recorded videos, like Skip and I will be live in a studio. As you join, you will immediately be put into a small networking room. So you will get to meet folks, which will be interesting. And then we are going to be using a product called Mixtros starting after our annual member meeting on September 22nd. You preload it with like 10 questions, and how people answer the questions is how you connect them to then be in a small group. And so we plan on using that for our member meeting, and really all the questions are going to be about us because it's our annual meeting, and it's going to be like, why did you join? What are you hoping to get from this? And then people will be grouped together. But then we plan to continue to use that tool to perhaps have some continued diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, and get people that have similar interests in that area in small groups of like 10. So we've been doing some of that. We have actually done a lot more curated, and by that I mean we're looking more at different functional areas that need to be able to talk to each other, that want to be able to talk to each other. And we tend to do it small. Like what we've seen is it gets pretty unruly. I'm sure you've been on one of those calls where it's like everyone's trying to talk on top of everybody else and it doesn't work perfectly. And so we've kept those small. We're still kind of struggling to figure out how you do that in a really large format. It just may not work for us. But so what we've heard, I think a lot of companies doing, some of the engagement has come from actually disconnecting. Like I spoke to a member company yesterday, and they're about to have their third like mental health Friday. And it means nobody emails anything to anybody, just to give people some time to just like step away. We've seen everything from folks having lunch delivered to like the bring your pet to work day, all different sorts of things. There's a company that I know that has a perpetual Zoom open to function as the water cooler. And so it, again, like you feel like you need to talk to somebody, you can pop in, somebody may be in there, they may not be, but like I think that's a really interesting idea. And then we've seen some of the like activity type things, like team like paint evening where people just like, get together. We've done some karaoke, we've seen lip sync. We're gonna one of the things that we've actually had success with some other partners is less about like the employee engagement, but like folks that still want to volunteer and give back, which is much harder to do in this socially distanced world. And so we've been able to get volunteers to Chick Tech and the iUrban team and folks that really want to be providing mentorship through their online program. So that's been great too. And that's another way that I would say from an engagement. But from running a company, I think my perspective today is like you have to listen to what your employees need and respond to that. I mean, we've lived in a crisis since March. We continue to live in a crisis. You know, here in Oregon, what are they saying? It may be April before kids are back in person in school.
Yeah.
Like, that's hard.
Yeah, it feels like it's getting to this point where, you know, first couple months, it's like, okay, we can do this. And now it's like really stretching out. And it's like, okay, how are we going to get through it now? And so I think some of these ideas that you're bringing up are great. I think some of them are a little bit counterintuitive. Like, how do you get more engaged? You actually disengage, right? The no email Fridays or the, you know, the mental health Fridays. I think that's a great idea. So I wanted to switch gears just a little bit. We've been talking about the Technology Association of Oregon. I know the technology sector, we work with a lot of people in that sector, and I know that's a really important part of the economy for Oregon. Can you, given your perspective at the association, just paint a little bit of a picture for how important the technology firms and technology employees are to the economy in Oregon, and just give us a high-level overview of the Oregon tech landscape?
For sure. So we're an interesting market because we're like heavily startup. We have a lot of tech-enabled companies, and then we're a lot of business to business. And we're living in this very interesting kind of, it's like three-prong. We've got like thriving, surviving, and then struggling. And it's interesting because there is a lot of the tech sector that is thriving. So I know we may talk about this later on, but I'll jump ahead. Like anybody that's doing any kind of infrastructure, internet service provider, data on cloud, in the cloud versus on-prem, like anybody that's doing any kind of digital, any kind of software that could be part of a digital transformation is doing really well. Like I can give you an example of one of our member companies in Eugene. They're called Cognitopia, and they are an education platform really focused on students that have different learning abilities. And it came out of their founder, I think has a sibling that's autistic. And so he wanted to be able, from an academic and an education perspective, solve this problem. And that was their sweet spot. They were K through 12. Well, all of a sudden, companies, big companies around the country, frankly, around the world, are realizing that they have employees that have learning differences that make this type of remote work very challenging. And so they've seen this whole market open up for their education platform that they never anticipated. And so like you see companies like that are doing really well. And then you see companies that are serving, you know, the hospitality industry or the airlines or retail, and they are having a much harder time.
Right.
And I
so
know
if one group of companies that are thriving would be more infrastructure type companies, and the ones that are merely surviving or struggling, is it all just sort of vertical dependent? Like if you're serving retail, obviously you're going to be struggling right now. Or are there other similarities between the companies that are in the other two buckets there?
There's some other factors. Like I think that one thing from an investment standpoint, and I know you've probably talked about investing with some of your other guests and like access to capital. There's not a lot being invested right now. And so if you were a startup that was pre-funded or early seed funding, like you don't have a lot of money left and there's not a lot coming in. And so that is a challenge. And that's going to be like regardless of industry. And
are you starting to see or hear companies transitioning from this initial mindset, which is very defensive, you know, we need to conserve cash, don't spend a penny unless you let me know about it, to now seeing opportunities like the company that you're mentioning, and transitioning from defense to offense, so to speak, of like, okay, now it's time, let's make a bet, let's spend some money.
For sure. There's some, so that's a really great question. And some of that is not just specific to tech, but it's why some of our tech partners are thriving. So like an example would be somebody that had on their plan, a company that had on their plan to move everything off-prem and go to the cloud. Well, business is slower. It looks different right now. If they're going to make that capital investment, like why not do it now when it's less disruptive to their business, because their business is already disrupted. So then you're seeing those companies that provide those services just like thriving. And so you are seeing some of that investment. But then you hear like there was I think a story that came out about Salesforce where they earned well above their projections, but they're still going to downsize by 1,500 people. Great for the market, not great for those 1,500 people. Right. And so I think that we haven't fully seen like the fallout from this yet. And so I'm like hesitant to say like one way or the other, like, is it all in spend or is it all in save? Because it's just really a mix. Mm-hmm. But we have seen that, you know, we have tons of companies in our ecosystem that are hiring for tech talent. And so that is indicative that things are going well when they are moving forward with their hires. I would still say people are a little hesitant to spend. But I think we're all, and you're sitting in this too, like you're a business leader, like how are you planning for next year? Like we're all sort of in this situation where we're like, okay, so do we plan to stay online, which lowers our expenses? Do we assume if you're a software as a service company that no one on your sales team gets on a plane next year? So, okay, expenses are lower. So what does that mean for revenue? And so I think that remains to be seen. And if people reallocate budget to keep folks employed. So I'll be curious how that unfolds.
Yeah, it's interesting point and interesting situation we're in. You know, we're a little bit halfway through the year. The traditional strategic planning process starts in Q4 for the next year, but it feels like there's not even a whole lot of visibility out of quarter, let alone, you know, next year. And so, you know, how do you make those plans? But the one, I interviewed an economist with, actually out of the University of Oregon, and we were talking about, obviously there's a lot of people unemployed, but there's also a pretty high number of open positions, and companies are, you know, posting those positions, but they're not necessarily maybe fulfilling them, because there's still kind of this benefit to like, let's wait and see. If we can wait to fill the position, you know, that's a good thing. One of the things that might unstick that would be if there's a shortage of labor supply. And I know specifically in the technology industry, there's been a lack of engineers and a lack of programmers. Are you still seeing that? Or so these positions that are out there that companies are posting, are they having trouble finding the talent to fill those? Or is it more of just a delay, let's not quite hire yet because we're not sure what the future is going to look like?
That's a super nuanced question. And so I have to add a little bit of the inclusion overlay with that, because we see a lot of companies that want to make hires of non, what I prefer to say, historically excluded folks, so women and BIPOC, and that from an organ tech standpoint, that's a hard sell apparently, whether it's in a pandemic or not. So that's been like a little bit of a challenge. Then the question is, well, if tech companies are going to stay remote indefinitely, I mean, I think Twitter or Facebook or somebody said that, like, where do people need to live? Like, can they live anywhere? And do you have access to a different talent pool, a more diverse talent pool, or just like a broader talent pool if people can work anywhere? So we heard that for a little while. But now we're hearing that, like, and I think this is pretty consistent with probably what you're seeing, like company culture is important, and like being in the office is important. And so if you make a hire for somebody that's like, well, I'm going to live in Ashland and work for a Portland company as an engineer. Okay, great. But like in 18 months, we want you to be back in Portland because we're going to be in person again. And so we're seeing more of that, like, how much of this remote is going to stay fully remote, like how close do people need to be. And so I think some of the hesitation to hire is like, where are people going to live or be living in the next 18 months if they can work from anywhere? And so that has been a really interesting, and that conversation has changed dramatically in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's really on both sides. It's, where do we expect people to live from a company's perspective, but from the employee perspective, are they going to expect me to move? Maybe I can work remote now, but am I going to be expected to move? And so that obviously factors into the decision.
And to like go farther down that example of like, say someone wants to live in Ashland and work for a Portland company. Okay, well, does that mean that their salary looks different because Ashland is less expensive to live in? Right. And should that factor in, and can come, and I don't know the answer to that, but these are just conversations that like we've heard. But then you start, I could go down a rabbit hole on that. So it's really interesting. Like I know many people that have been hired or transitioned jobs during this time, like an overwhelmingly surprising number. We've even been asked if we could do a virtual/online onboarding class because so many of our members have been bringing people on board during this time and they want to know best practices.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next question. Is I can see how people, our company, we haven't hired anybody throughout this, and we've switched to virtual, and it's worked pretty well. I mean, we all worked together for years before, and it was a pretty seamless transition to this. But the thought of hiring somebody and onboarding them and introducing them to your culture like this over Zoom seems difficult. So what are some of the best practices that you're seeing, and what's working? If people are out there hiring in this environment, what's working to bring somebody new on board and engage them with the team?
Team engagement, I'm probably not the best to answer, but I think from an onboarding perspective, like we're just seeing companies do more. Like, and this is actually pretty common, I think, in like pharmaceutical sales where you do work from your house, but like we see people getting like a stand-up desk sent to them, or at least a desktopper, or the stuff to make their home office like appealing. I've seen a lot of swag, like you get your swag kit sent to you. And then it's the unfortunate, like weird Zoom get to know yous. But one thing that I have heard, and this actually came from my sister-in-law, whose new job started the first day that we all had to work from home. She was like, what was hard for me was I took a role where I didn't have a lot of experience in that function. I knew the company well. She's like, but my assumption was that I was going to be able to just pop into people's offices and ask them questions. And that's one thing that I have seen increase. The more we've been on video, the more I've actually seen people rely more on phone too. Like, I don't know how y'all are working, but us, it's definitely like an integrated mix of phone, Zoom, email, and Slack. And I think that because people are more available, they can be a little bit more responsive. But yeah, from an onboarding perspective, we've seen folks, we've actually had some people that have gone into the office, like, and then we've heard that too. It's just like 3 or 4 days, but you're in there in the safe OSHA, Oregon state law compliant, masked on way, to at least get like a feel for the space. And then it's just as many of these online get to know yous as you can do.
As you can stand, right? The one interesting thing you mentioned in there is the phone, and I wonder if the phone's making a comeback. So we've seen some success just kind of randomly calling clients just to check in and chat, and people have more time to talk. And so you end up having conversations that aren't so much about finance, but are about what's going on in life. And just with employees, just, calling people just to chat and check in, and over the phone and not a Zoom, because it's a different interaction, and just long conversations that nobody had time for before. Maybe one of the silver linings of 2020.
Absolutely. And I think the phone, even when like, pre-FaceTime, like you could be on the phone. And I remember my mom doing this and like cooking dinner. Granted, she would have the phone like awkwardly, like she didn't have the fancy earpods. But like, I think the phone makes it a little bit more appealing. Like, this is hard during the day. I don't know if you've read any of the research, but like, I can see you right now and it's just you and I. So it's almost like we're face to face, but if there were 10 people on this, like, and you're trying to watch everybody's facial expressions and try to understand how they're engaging, and if they're engaging or if they're checking their email or what's going on, it gets really exhausting. And I think the phone, because it removes the the visual part just is like so nice. And it's just
Yeah.
nice to talk to somebody on the phone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a throwback.
It's a throwback.
Yeah. So other than the phone, kind of my final question before the closing question here would be, what other trends have you seen that have been accelerated in 2020? You know, people are using the phone more, maybe, you know, specific verticals, education, online events, obviously those businesses have been accelerated, but are you seeing any kind of bigger macro trends that have been accelerated either just across the economy in general or specific to tech here in 2020?
I think part of that's kind of like a blended question for me, because I think we've seen just tech change the landscape so drastically. Access to tech and access to internet and access to devices has become like a huge part of the conversation, which is then changing like, what does supply chain look like? I mean, there was an article this weekend in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Why do we still not have enough toilet paper? Like, how is this a possibility? Yeah. But what I'm seeing that I think is exciting and where there's a cool opportunity is like this whole narrative around the digital transformation and how many companies and industries are now being like thrust into that. And I like it. It's like there was an article today about Milk Run, you know, based here, Portland based, woman owned and run, about taking the milkman concept and bringing it into the 21st century. And we're seeing a lot of that. Like, I think some of my most heartwarming stories that I've heard are like Wooden Tulip, or the Wooden Shoe Tulip Company down in the Mid Valley. Pandemic hit right as tulip season was coming in, and they weren't going to be able to sell their tulips. And so they created an online retail store to not buy tulips ourselves, but to get tulips delivered to nursing homes and to or essential workers and first responders. And they basically sold out. And they did that nationally. People invested nationally to make sure that was happening. And like, what a cool way to leverage tech to sell flowers that would not have come into fruition if it were not for this situation. And I think like that's exciting, because all industries are doing that. Even industries that were lagging behind and weren't quite ready to make those steps are being forced to move forward. And you're not gonna come back from that. And so I think that with that, you're gonna start seeing the concept of data-driven business and the machine learning and the AI, robotics. I mean, all of that is going to come more into fruition. And I think that what we haven't seen yet, but we will, because of a lot of your questions and about building community, is like a whole slew of technology advances around online collaboration for students, for workers, for seniors. You know, how are you engaging with your grandparents right now? I mean, I think that you'll see that as a product of this time.
Yeah, well, that's a really cool story about the Tulip Company, and with the new software to engage in this way, it can't come soon enough. So hopefully some of that stuff happens in the near future.
I hope so. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the conversation today, Cara. Thanks for spending some time with us. My closing question that I've been asking everybody, which is, when things do get back to normal, you know, whatever that ends up looking like, what are you either most excited to get back to that you've been missing in 2020, or on the other side, what have you become convinced that you can actually just cut out of your life? You don't need to bring it back, and that you're going to get rid of permanently as a result of this year?
Oh my gosh, can I do one of each?
You can do one of each. That's a popular response.
I can tell you. So you know, I'm from the East Coast, and I have 10 nieces and nephews, and I cannot wait to see them. Like I miss them hard. Online tea parties, and you have children, you'll appreciate this. Online tea parties with a 6-year-old pouring her own tea from a hot teapot is absolutely terrifying, and you can do nothing but be like, oh, please don't say that. You cannot help. And so I'm really pumped when this is over to see them. I hope they're still little kids and don't grow too much. And the one thing that's like surprised me, so I'm a runner. I get to still do that. I'm also a vegetarian. And so going to restaurants sometimes for me is like, there's not always great options, or I'm like, I'm spending $40 and I'm just basically eating grilled vegetables. And I've really loved cooking. And so I want our restaurant industry to succeed and thrive, but I have not really missed going out. I'm actually really enjoying my nightly menu planning, and in particular with the sun in the garden. Like, that's been really fun.
Yeah, cool. Well, 2 good responses. I will tell you, getting back to being able to connect with people face to face has been a very common theme. So you're in good company there. So
I mean,
again,
I want to hug those little people before
Yeah.
they think I'm like not cool.
yeah. Yeah, you get a few years, I think, I'm sure. Well, again, thanks, Cara. This has been fantastic, and thanks for making the time.
Yeah, that was fun.